Welcome back to Art of Citizenry, where we unpack the systemic power structures that have shaped culture, politics, and policy. I am your host, Manpreet Kalra. Today, we're talking about something that is everywhere right now, something many of us are already using every day, often without asking what it's taking from us and who ultimately benefits. We're talking about AI. Artificial intelligence, specifically the vested corporate interests of this sudden AI era. When people talk about AI bias, they're often pointing to one thing: biased outputs, responses that reproduce racist, sexist, or otherwise discriminatory stereotypes. But what gets labeled as an AI hallucination is often something else entirely: the resurfacing of systemic prejudice embedded in data, design choices, and power structures. If we treat AI bias as a technical bug that can simply be patched, we risk repeating a pattern we know all too well, addressing symptoms while refusing to confront the structural conditions that produce the harm in the first place. We are approaching this episode from a holistic lens, allowing ourselves to sit with the complexity of both the value offered and harms perpetuated by the way each aspect of our lives becomes a data point in a predictive model. We are sitting down with someone who understands the intimacy of everyday tech use and is still able to interrogate the power dynamics involved and corporate priorities at play. Together, we unpack the uncomfortable truth that a lot of us are opting into systems that learn our behaviors intimately, sometimes even better than ourselves, while manipulating our understanding of truth by defining it for us. So today, I'm joined by Vauhini Vara, author of Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age, and a journalist who's been reporting on big tech for years. Her work sits at the intersection of technology and capitalism. We talk about language as labor and what accountability could look like when the infrastructure is, of course, privately owned and constantly evolving. This isn't a conversation with easy answers. It's about sitting with complexity and the uncomfortable reality that opting out is rarely simple.
I'm Vauhini Vara, and I'm the author of Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. My family moved to the Seattle area in the sort of mid to late 90s, and I grew up in a suburb right next to where Jeff Bezos and his wife, Mackenzie Scott, were building Amazon. I went to college at Stanford right when Mark Zuckerberg was building Facebook and moved the headquarters to Palo Alto, right next to where my college campus was. And then I graduated college and I was working at the San Francisco bureau of the Wall Street Journal just as Google was going public and Facebook was growing. And I ended up being the journal's first Facebook reporter. And later, fast forward 10 years, was one of the first reporters to write a profile of Sam Altman, now the CEO of OpenAI. And so both personally and professionally, I have had a long relationship with technology, like a very intimate relationship with technology, not just as a user, but as somebody who has gotten acquainted in various ways with the people running these big technology companies.
It's apparent that one of the fastest ways AI entered the mainstream was through writing tools. As an independent journalist, I understand that writing is not just about output. It's a relationship. Writing is labor, it's expression, it's persuasion, it's an interpersonal experience. And now, in this era of AI-generated writing, it can feel like writing is simply about quantity and speed of output. But before we go any further, I want to slow us down just a bit and ground listeners in what we're actually talking about when we say AI. When people talk about artificial intelligence today, they're usually referring to statistical systems trained on enormous amounts of existing data, language, images, patterns that learn to predict what comes next. Large language models like ChatGPT generate outputs by identifying probability-based relationships on patterns in the material they're trained on. GPT-3 was released in 2020 by OpenAI and represented a major leap in scale. It was trained on hundreds of billions of words pulled from books, articles, websites, and other text sources, and produced outputs that felt fluent, coherent, and emotionally resonant. In 2021, you published an essay, Ghosts, in which you used GPT-3 as a co-writer to process and narrate the experience of losing your sister. Your essay offered insight into very human emotions about loss. Most recently, you actually published an article on New Yorker's website describing an experiment where creative writing graduate students preferred AI-generated prose over human-written work, roughly 2/3 of the time when the authorship was anonymized, which can be frightening as we think about the question that gets tossed around often. Will AI replace you pick your profession of choice and fill in the blank? What I'm really interested in, and what I'd love to hear you reflect on, is how you think this has evolved as someone who has written alongside AI, not outsourcing authorship to it, but engaging it deliberately as part of the creative process. What has that collaboration revealed to you about what AI can and very clearly cannot replace?
I think for anybody who thinks of writing as a form of communication, right, as something that is inherently about people talking to other people, it's hard to understand like what the place should be for AI in that, because AI takes so many resources, because it's so expensive to build AI, and therefore AI products are always going to reflect the goals and values of the companies behind them. I think the reason people start talking about the potential use of AI for writing is that communication, in addition to sort of broadly speaking, just being the tool that we use to talk to one another as humans, is also something that has become monetizable, right? It is an aspect of the labor that we provide for the companies we work for, right? And in that sense, it's something that like one can attach a dollar value to. And I think that's the tension, because if you think of AI is capable, AI products can produce text. Text is something that's monetizable. So in that way, it makes sense that some people and organizations are interested in how AI could be used to generate text more cheaply than humans can, essentially. But that requires like a very narrow, specific lens for understanding what language even is.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you is that AI doesn't just reflect reality. It has the capacity to shape what we collectively come to understand as truth. What feels especially important here is that it isn't just a cultural debate anymore. There's a rapidly expanding legal record developing alongside it, which is particularly interesting to follow in the era of deregulation that we're in right now. So, what we're seeing is this growing number of cases related to copyright infringement and data privacy propping up. One of the most notable cases being the New York Times v. OpenAI and Microsoft, a copyright infringement lawsuit filed in late 2023, which alleges that OpenAI and Microsoft trained their large language models, ChatGPT and Copilot, on articles published by the Times without permission or compensation. Both Microsoft and OpenAI are for-profit corporations financially benefiting from training large language models on vast amounts of copyrighted material. Their technology is built on pre-existing data. We also saw this tension play out recently in litigation involving Anthropic, the creators behind Claude, where reporting revealed that training data included large numbers of scanned and pirated books. So when we zoom out, what we're really talking about isn't whether AI can write well or even whether it can imitate human creativity. We're talking about power. Who gets to extract value, whose labor becomes invisible, and who bears the cost? So, how should we be thinking about consent, compensation, and power, especially when the training material AI depends on is the work of journalists, academics, writers, scientists, and individuals spanning all industries who never agreed to be part of this experiment.
I think the way in which we have talked about AI companies' use of existing text to train their models has been through this lens that I was describing, in which text is a product, right? Like it has monetary value, which I think is a very valuable, legitimate lens to use to talk about this stuff. It's also, I would argue, a somewhat narrow one, because the only people who care about that really are the owners of the copyrighted material. And in our cultural context, authors just don't have a lot of political or economic power. And so anytime you're going to pit the interests of authors against the interests of big technology companies that have hundreds of well-paid people in Washington, D.C., in state capitals, lobbying for their interests, it's hard to imagine a world in which those with, the smaller amount of political and economic capital win out. And so what I argue for is a sort of more expansive understanding of why it is that it is problematic for tech companies to be appropriating all this language for their own purposes. And I think the piece of it that's less talked about is the way in which, if we are using AI companies' products to produce text, that text too is potentially going to reflect the values and interests of those companies rather than our own. It's also the case sometimes, I've written about AI in education, and sometimes people who are proponents of using AI in education will compare AI to the calculator, saying, well, people were really upset when calculators were introduced in schools. The one difference here is that the calculator is a product that a school district or a family can pay for and then own and then use for their own purposes, right? A more proper analogy would be if when you bought a calculator, you actually had to pay monthly to use that calculator, and the company that manufactured the calculator had the ability of inserting their preferred answers into the calculator. So if the company benefited by spreading the message that 2 + 2 = 5, the company could insert that into the calculator and make us all believe that 2 + 2 = 5. And so I think when we talk about power, it has partly to do with copyright, of course, but I think it would behoove people who are concerned about the proliferation of dependence on AI to sort of think more broadly about how power is exercised through these products.
Right. And so when you talk about bias in AI, there are a few different kinds of biases at play. There is, as you're raising, the bias of the software toward itself and its founder. The other concern, I believe, has to do with confirmation bias and filter bubbles. When people interact with systems like ChatGPT, those systems learn, at least in part, from the patterns of engagement, what users ask, what they accept, what they push back on, etc. And so over time, that can create a feedback loop where the model increasingly reflects back what a user already believes rather than challenging it. According to an article published by Harvard Business Review, AI systems don't just inherit bias from their training data, they also amplify the cognitive biases of the people who interact with them. That means if we ask questions or interpret answers through our own assumptions or blind spots, the systems can reflect and reinforce those patterns back to us. So it feels like there are two layers of power operating at once. On one level, there's the question of whose values and assumptions are embedded in the system itself, the corporate incentives, training data choices, moderation rules, and design decisions that shape what the model treats as authoritative or reasonable. And on another level, there's this more individualized dynamic where AI can reinforce a person's existing worldview while feeding back to them what they want to hear.
I fed the language of my book to ChatGPT. The goal of that was to have readers engage critically with ChatGPT generated text in a way that people don't when they're using ChatGPT on an everyday basis, right? So if you bring the same sort of critical attention to ChatGPT dialogue that you would to any book that you're reading, you're going to be able to analyze that dialogue differently. And what happened when I fed the language in my book, which is quite critical of how these companies operate and how, and critical of our complicity in the continued success of these companies. What ChatGPT did over the course of that dialogue was try to persuade me to write a book that was more positive about the tech industry, about OpenAI, about Sam Altman, right? And I wanted readers to see that and to realize that anytime they use ChatGPT, the same mechanism is at play, right? And so you're right. There's a sort of dual approach to language production in which the product is serving the interests of its corporate owner while using language that is sort of rhetorically customized to be persuasive to me in particular.
I'll be honest, even now, if I've written something, I feel this very real hesitation about letting any of it pass through systems like ChatGPT and other large language models. Even if I have my privacy settings set to opt out of using my data to train the system for others, I know I'm not alone in that. A lot of writers are making these calculations about risk, about control, about whether engaging with these tools means giving something up that can't be reclaimed. So I'm really curious for you how that question has shown up as someone who intentionally fed their work into an LLM. And just to ground this for listeners, an LLM or large language model is a type of AI designed to process and generate human-like language by identifying patterns in massive amounts of text and predicting what comes next.
I felt almost as if I was like taking one for the team, like it's clear, hopefully, from the book that this is not something that I think is beneficial to us as writers, as individuals. I don't think anybody benefits from sharing their own text with ChatGPT and saying, give me advice on it for various reasons. So one factor has to do with how these products try to influence us. And then the other has to do with how the products are using our own text to further train their models. To be clear, I did switch that toggle bar such that ChatGPT, OpenAI would not be able to use the text that I was feeding it in order to further train the model in general. However, even now, if I go to ChatGPT and ask it a question, oftentimes it will say, given your interest in technology and society and the fact that you're a writer, blah, 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 right? Because it believes it knows certain things about me.
So a few years ago, there was this case in which someone won first place at the Colorado State Fair's digital arts competition. The piece was AI generated using Midjourney. According to the person behind the piece, he spent over 80 hours refining with over 900 prompts. Recognizing that there are many arguments that can be explored here, the question I come back to is how do we think about authorship when it comes to AI? How many prompts, revisions, and iterations does it take before something feels like your work rather than the model's output?
One of the most fulfilling projects I've worked on as a journalist was this oral history project, where it's my byline, but all of the language in the project is actually the words of other people. So it was this oral history project having to do, as a lot of my work has to do with globalization, sort of global capitalism and the way in which it's changed people's working lives. So it was profiles of people all over the world in Ghana, South Africa, Colombia, India, China, many other places, sort of saying in their own words how their lives had changed. So that itself complicates ideas about authorship, right? Because I'm the author of the oral history piece of this article. They didn't get paid for it. They don't get credit for having written it, but it's their language. There's so many examples of ways in which like one person's name might be on an article, but other people will be involved in the creation of the text. So I think that addresses the question of like whether my name can be on something that people other than me contributed to, because that's been happening for as long as literature has existed, as long as journalism has existed. The next question then is, what happens when some of that text is not generated by humans, but is generated by products owned by big AI companies? For me, the interesting thing to think about there is disclosure. So, for example, with each oral history included in that big package that I wrote, it was for Business Week. There's a photograph of the person, their name, their age, and where they live, right? So it's clear that that particular oral history is attributed to that person. Similarly, in my book or in my writing in general, anytime I'm using AI generated text, I'll flag that. So in the book, for example, any AI generated text is in a different typeface so that readers know what they're encountering. And so what I'm really saying is, let's look at this together. I, as the assumed author, you as the reader, like, what I'm saying isn't that I wrote this, it's that I'm asking us to look at this together, right? And that's what I'm doing with AI generated text as well. Something that I've never done is publish something in which like I'm using AI with the goal of like, where my goal in using AI is to like make something more beautiful or more interesting. My goal is always to like critique something about the AI product's output. And I think your question becomes more complicated if I were, for example, to like write a short story and ask an AI model to make the short story more compelling somehow. That's not something that I've ever done because it just doesn't interest me.
It brings to mind the Not by AI badge, which helps audiences identify content created by humans as opposed to content created by an AI tool. So we're clearly in a moment where people are actively adapting, trying to figure out how we talk about authorship, credibility, and originality. While I think this distinction is important, for example, as you mentioned, crediting and identifying the voices that made up your oral history pieces, I think the integration of AI into our various modes of expression actually diversifies what we label as our work. I think AI allows for people to bypass certain amounts of legwork and bring a more curated lens to their project. However, that said, it cannot be used as a replacement for creativity in and of itself. Otherwise, we lose our own ability to think critically and creatively. Oftentimes, we think of AI as purely the mechanism of creation versus like a scrap paper, per se. In Searches, you describe the dissonance around big tech for empowerment, understanding, and even communion, while also participating in exploitation. How would you describe that tension in plain terms? And where do you feel it most in everyday life?
So I would say that the thing I was most interested in doing with the book was complicating the kind of existing narratives about big tech. Because I think oftentimes there's this kind of binary understanding where we say the two positions are either big technology companies are exploiting us and we have no choice in the matter. This is being imposed on us. Or the kind of other narrative is big technology companies are providing products that are really useful to people and are making the world a better place, right? And I think both of those binary narratives are incomplete. And I think what's more interesting is to think about the way in which these companies' products are useful to us. And so we use the products, and that's what makes the companies successful, right? So there's this symbiotic relationship in which if we're arguing that the companies are doing something exploitative, if we are using any of those companies' products, we have to admit that we also are participating in our own exploitation, the exploitation of the planet. And that's like an uncomfortable place to sit, you know?
I think that really captures the reality of the world we're living in. These companies have embedded themselves so deeply into everyday life that sometimes we don't even realize the extent to which we are participating in our own exploitation.
Yeah. There's this common misconception, I think, that there was a previous version of the internet that was more open, more equal, more creative, more interesting. There are ways in which that's true, But it's also the case that the very origins of the internet had capitalism baked into them, right? So I write in the first chapter of my book about being introduced to the internet through AOL. I used AOL at a friend's house, and at some point soon after that, my family subscribed to AOL. And the way in which we initially subscribed to AOL was through this CD we received in the mail. Use the CD and you get 15 free hours of internet, and then you have to pay for it after that, right? Well, it turns out that CD was part of a multi-$100 million marketing campaign on the part of AOL to get people across this country and internationally to use their product, right? So I didn't start using AOL because in some organic way that had nothing to do with capitalism. I started using AOL because we got this CD in the mail. Similarly, some of the very first websites that existed already were experimented with integrating advertising, like classified style advertising into the websites, because they found that it costs some money to run a website, and they were doing it because they thought maybe there was a business here, and the advertising was successful, right? So some of the things that we think of as being part of the internet now and not a part of the earlier internet, I think it's a little bit of sort of rose-colored retrospective analysis. And in reality, I think where we are now is a sort of logical progression from where we were 30 years ago.
Absolutely. Capitalism has never been absent from the internet. It always has been part of the equation. And that really reframes that nostalgia we sometimes have about a supposedly pure digital past. In your book, you talk about Google searches, Amazon reviews, and what you call the raw material of everyday life. What does that collage reveal, in your view, about how platforms learn us and how we've intentionally, or more often unintentionally, trained systems to influence us?
I think there's a difference between describing for readers what's happening and showing what that looks like. So, for example, I allow Google to keep an archive of all my searches over the past decades, in part because I make use of that archive. So if I lose something, for example, I'll often go back into my Google search archive to remember where I was on a given day or what I was doing. A lot of people think that Google doesn't track their search archives, but if you think it doesn't and you've never looked into it, it probably does, because a lot of these things are things that you actually have to actively opt out of. So something to think about is, if it's not worth it to you to have that archive, go into Google, go into various Amazon, OpenAI, go into your product settings with each of these, and you can turn some of these things off. I wanted to show the way in which the fact that this tracking is beneficial to me also means that Google has a sort of more complete archive of who I am and how to target advertising and other marketing messages to me and otherwise influence me than maybe any other organization or company or individual even in the world. And I wanted to do that by showing what that archive looks like. So the very first thing that I wrote in this book was this essay made up of my Google searches, where you as a reader can see what I searched for over a period of 10 years. And hopefully, it's poignant and it's funny, and it allows a reader to get to know me, because as a writer, that's always my goal. And yet, at the same time, if you're reading that text and have also read the preceding chapter explaining how all of this functions, there's no way to read the text and experience the poignancy and the humor without also thinking about the way in which it's Google that has all this information and is now going to be able to monetize it.
Yeah, absolutely. As you're talking, I'm realizing that you really can trace an arc of a person's life through their search history. Stages of life, even the most lucrative stages within a capitalist society: moving, marriage, pregnancy. what someone is worried about, what they're planning, what they're grieving, what they're curious about. Whoever has access to that information probably really knows what and how to sell to you. And as you're uncovering here, different platforms, may it be Google, Amazon, Meta, etc., essentially have all this data by default, unless we all intentionally and individually opt out of it. So previously, I worked in data-driven marketing. And frankly, the data we had available to us over a decade ago from various platforms is already so powerful. The gravity of that has only escalated. It allows marketers to really understand your fears and beliefs, market to them, and make consumers believe they need certain things, or even to believe certain ways that feed into the profit machine for companies. I believe it was the founder of Apple who said, don't create what people need, create what they want, right? And that's really what some of this data allows companies to do. But going back to the many different biases in AI, it isn't just about what comes out of the system. It's also about what goes into it and how we use it. From data collection to data labeling and classification, the way models are trained, for example, data optimization techniques, often favor majority group predictions over minority groups. These systemic errors can lead to unfair or discriminatory outcomes, reinforcing stereotypes, misrepresenting historically marginalized groups, or outright excluding certain perspectives entirely. At a deeper level, AI can be seen as a reflection of systemic prejudice that exists in society because it not only reflects patterns in data, but the structures of the society that produce that data. And so biases in AI can have significant real-world consequences, particularly when they reinforce discrimination or social inequities. There is a great explainer of the various types of bias that exist that was put together by Chapman University. Selection bias, for example, shows up when systems like facial recognition are trained mostly on lighter skinned faces, leading to higher error rates for people with darker skin tones. Stereotyping bias reinforces harmful assumptions like translation tools defaulting to female pronouns for nurse and male pronouns for doctor. And outgroup homogeneity bias flattens difference altogether, treating people from underrepresented groups as more alike than they actually are. So, in your view, where does bias actually live in the system?
Well, biased results are a useful place to start because that's where it all manifests, right? So we can think about how those biased results emerge, and they have partly to do with the way in which the technology is built. It also has partly to do with the interests of the companies behind those technologies. I think the underexamined piece of it actually has to do with biased results, in that when we talk about bias in AI-generated material, oftentimes we're talking about these things, and I think it's because these are easier to quantify, but we talk about things like, are outputs, do they reflect race bias? Do they reflect gender bias? And there are ways to sort of like quantify that. What I think is a lot less understood is the way in which these products' outputs reflect bias having to do with the values and interests of big technology companies, right? So there was a point at which OpenAI has this document describing how its products should behave. And there was a point at which there was a line in that document saying that the products should, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the products should espouse a perspective that technology and progress have always been positive for the world and lead to great outcomes, which is a biased perspective. And if that biased perspective is embedded in ChatGPT's responses to questions about technology's role in society, like that is significant. That language isn't there anymore, but it is an example of how this kind of thing can function. The other thing is that there has been research showing these insidious ways in which linguistic bias shows up. And what I mean by that is that For example, when people who use Indian English ask ChatGPT to edit their language, ChatGPT will turn that language into standard American English in a way that implicitly suggests that the correct English is standard American English rather than Indian English, which I would expect that maybe more people in the world speak than the American variant.
Absolutely. Given that so much of this technology is developed in the United States, that means a lot of the bias baked into these systems is anchored in American English, American norms, and American social expectations. So let's talk about accountability. We know AI systems can hallucinate, discriminate, and launder misinformation or propaganda, often as a direct result of what they're trained on. So who do you think is actually accountable here? And realistically, what does accountability look like?
That's the tough part of this. I mean, I think it's always useful to think about the incentives behind the production of this language that these models are producing, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So you have the companies that create these products, and I think holding companies accountable is sort of the first place we go. But then you have to peel the onion back and think about the way in which these companies, some of them are publicly traded, some of them are private companies that do get investments still from individuals and public entities. And the VC firms sometimes, their own investors, the people investing into these funds, right, can be held accountable. And so the thing that makes this difficult is that some people who critique AI and want the companies to be held accountable are probably through, their retirement fund and some mutual fund that's in that retirement fund are investors in Google or Apple, right? Or Meta, Facebook's parent company, and can think about the way in which the power they have as part owners of these companies could be exercised, right? So if we're talking about like where power can be exercised, that's one potential lever. Another thing to think about, though, is the way in which we actually already have models for other ways to build technology, right? Something like Wikipedia, which last I checked was the 7th most visited website in the world and is run by a foundation using volunteer labor, right? You can think about something like the Firefox browser, which again is run by a foundation. Again, some of this is complicated by the fact that some of these foundations in turn do get a lot of money from companies, right? Signal, the chat app Signal, is run by a foundation. And so there are also publicly owned technologies. So I live in the town of Fort Collins, Colorado, and there is public broadband here, municipal broadband provided by the city, right? So we can think about other ways to fund the development of technology so that the incentives are lined up with public benefit rather than the needs of companies.
It's important to follow the money. Even with nonprofit or foundation-based models, we need to ask who's funding the technology, what incentives are shaping it, and what could provide an alternative.
So we can imagine a world in which individuals and communities together decide what the technologies are that are beneficial to them, and then find ways to use communal funding, whether that's something like, GoFundMe-like or government funding to pay for those technologies, because it's always going to cost something to build any technology. If there's actually public benefit, then people will decide to fund that technology so that we can derive that public benefit. If the public benefit is actually maybe limited and there isn't actually anything that exciting or useful that we get from it, oftentimes that's where private capital comes in, right? And so even just thinking about who is funding what, I think should give us some clues about who's actually benefiting.
I think it's complicated. Public-private partnerships are nothing new. We would really have to reimagine where innovation sits in the public or private domain. And even then, the question becomes capacity and speed of innovation. I think about vaccines as an example, massively supported by public funding, but with intellectual property still held by private corporations, which means the public funds the innovation and the corporation profits from it. So even when public money is involved, the benefits aren't always shared equitably. And that gets back to how the American system is built around incentives, ownership, and profit. It really comes down to economic incentives, which underpin contemporary hypercapitalism.
Yeah, I think that's true. And even Elizabeth Warren, one of the most outspoken critics of contemporary capitalism, describes herself, last I checked, as somebody who has a lot of faith in capitalism and its ability to incentivize people to do things that are socially useful. And so, yeah, I don't want to overstate the point about public benefit and the role of private companies, right? Because you make a good point about that.
What feels most challenging is that we're trying to imagine alternatives while operating inside a system already shaped by modern capitalism. That tension between reforming from within and imagining something fundamentally different kind of feels like this perpetual fork in the road. But I do wonder if that's not just an intended outcome of this hyper-capitalist culture we're in now, diverting the collective from imagining something new because we believe in endlessly optimizing our current situation to accommodate our needs.
So I'm reading this book, Capitalism, A Global History. And what's useful to me about reading it is the way in which it shows how capitalism wasn't like some natural outgrowth. It's something that people decided to try out that then grew and became successful. Before that, there were other systems, right? And so we could build something else in the future. And that's what's exciting to me.
AI isn't just a technical system, it's a social one, shaped by human choices, economic incentives, and power. It reflects the values embedded in data, design, and governance, and it often mirrors the same inequalities we see offline. If we want a different relationship with these technologies, it starts with us interrogating who gets to define truth and what accountability could look like. Because how we engage with AI now will shape not just what these systems become, but what kind of society we're willing to build alongside them. Thank you, Vauhini Vara, for helping us unpack bias as much more than just a bad output, but the incentive structure, the ownership structure, the value system of the companies building these tools, and what it means when the infrastructure shaping our communication is privately owned, paywalled, and able to quietly steer our perceived truth. Accountability here is a question of leverage that stretches from the companies themselves to the investors and institutions bankrolling them. It's a provocation to imagine technology built with a different incentive structure altogether, where public benefit is the point and not just a marketing narrative. I encourage you to spend some time with Vauhini's book, Searches, which we'll link to in the show notes, along with other articles and resources referenced in this conversation. As always, Art of Citizenry exists to slow things down, to make space for critical thinking and collective imagination. If you found this episode meaningful, please share it, subscribe, give it 5 stars, and leave a review. It helps more people find these conversations. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. I hope you'll consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music is by Katrina Zemrak.